My parents casually said your sister needs money for her dream and you just sold your apartment. I took a deep breath and replied, I'm not funding her fantasy with my future. Then they actually sued me. I need to tell you about something that changed my life forever. After 6 years of saving every penny, working double shifts at Memorial Hospital, and living on ramen more nights than I care to count, I finally sold my apartment. Growing up, money was always tight. My parents fought constantly about bills, and I watched my mom cry over overdue notices while my dad disappeared for days whenever the pressure became too much. That chaos taught me one thing: financial independence wasn't just a goal, it was survival. At 22, after earning my nursing license, I scraped together enough for a down payment on a tiny one-bedroom apartment. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Every mortgage payment reminded me that I was building something my parents never had. Then one Tuesday, my realtor Monica called with incredible news. A cash buyer offered $185,000, exactly what the apartment appraised for after years of improvements. After paying off the mortgage and fees, I walked away with $94,500. It was more money than I'd ever had. I already had a plan. I wanted to buy a duplex, live in one unit, rent the other, and let the rental income cover most of the mortgage while building equity. It wasn't a dream anymore. It was a carefully researched investment strategy. I told my family about the sale during our monthly dinner. Mom congratulated me, though something about her tone felt strange. Dad barely reacted, and my younger sister Rose hardly looked up from her phone. I should have realized something was coming. My family never let good news stay simple. 2 weeks later, Rose texted me. Family meeting tomorrow at 2. Important business opportunity. Don't be late. Rose had never cared about business. She was 24, still living at home with a visual arts degree she'd barely used since graduating. While I had worked 60-hour weeks through nursing school, she'd taken pottery classes and backpacked through Europe with money from our parents. The next afternoon, I walked into my childhood home and found Rose standing beside an easel covered with poster boards, magazine cutouts, and glossy photos. Mom and Dad sat on the couch smiling proudly. Rose clapped her hands. I figured out my calling. I'm opening an art gallery. She launched into a presentation about a boutique gallery in the downtown arts district. The space she wanted rented for $8,000 a month. She needed renovations, inventory, insurance, and marketing. Then she casually announced she needed $120,000 to launch it. Mom and Dad looked concerned about the amount, but completely convinced the business would succeed. Rose insisted the gallery would become profitable within 6 months, backing up her claims with charts and projections based more on optimism than reality. She'd never managed a business, handled inventory, balanced a budget, or worked retail, yet she spoke with absolute confidence. The frightening part wasn't Rose's delusion. It was how completely my parents believed her. The following Sunday, Mom invited me back for what she called a family financial discussion. The dining room looked like a corporate boardroom. Rose had expanded her business plan into a thick document with market analysis, financial projections, and location research. She proudly explained why the arts district was perfect and predicted the gallery would break even within 8 months. As I reviewed the numbers, it became obvious she was comparing herself to established galleries with decades of experience. Dad finally admitted they didn't have the money. Mom mentioned they could borrow against the house, but didn't want to risk it. Then everything became clear. Rose leaned toward me with a bright smile. You just sold your apartment. You have the money. Mom quickly added that it wasn't really spending my money, only investing it. Dad called it a family opportunity that would benefit everyone. I stared at them in disbelief. They expected me to hand over the savings I'd spent 6 years building so Rose could gamble on an untested business. I quietly set the business plan on the table. I'm not investing in the gallery. Silence filled the room. Rose looked stunned. Mom asked what I meant. I repeated myself. Rose insisted she'd done the research. I pointed out that she'd never run a business, never kept a job longer than 6 months, had no industry experience, and no backup plan. Dad accused me of being harsh, saying everyone starts somewhere. I replied that starting somewhere shouldn't require risking someone else's life savings. Rose burst into tears and claimed I didn't support her dreams. I told her I supported dreams, not delusions. I explained that most new businesses fail and art galleries fail even more often. Mom dismissed the statistics, insisting Rose wasn't like everyone else. I reminded them that artistic talent and business ability weren't the same thing. I asked Rose whether she'd ever managed suppliers, taxes, inventory, or customer complaints. She admitted she'd learn along the way. With my money as your safety net, I answered. Dad argued that families help one another. That sentence finally broke my patience. I reminded them that nobody had helped me through nursing school when I worked multiple jobs, ate cheap meals, and struggled to pay my mortgage. Every step of my success came from sacrifice. Meanwhile, Rose had lived comfortably at home without paying rent. Mom insisted my situation was different because I'd chosen a practical career. I answered that I was successful because I'd accepted responsibility while Rose had avoided it. Rose accused me of punishing her for being creative. I replied that if her gallery was truly a good investment, a bank would finance it. Dad admitted no bank would approve her because she lacked collateral and experience. I told them that should tell them everything they needed to know. Then I stood up. This conversation is over. I'm not investing and I'm not changing my mind. Mom called me selfish as I walked toward the door. I turned back and reminded them that I'd spent 6 years earning every dollar and I wasn't throwing it away on a fantasy business. Rose cried that art was her passion. I answered that passion wasn't a business plan and walked out fully aware I'd just started a family war. What followed was the most exhausting month of my life. My family launched a coordinated campaign to wear me down. Mom called me repeatedly at work, crying about how devastated Rose was and insisting I was destroying her future. She described Rose as a sensitive artist whose dreams were slipping away because of me. Dad took a calmer approach. He arrived at my apartment with my favorite Thai takeout and patiently argued that investing in the gallery would earn me more than buying a duplex. I reminded him that my real estate plan was backed by research, while Rose's gallery was built entirely on hope. When neither approach worked, they recruited the rest of the family. My Aunt Patricia called to say she was disappointed in my selfishness. My cousin Jake accused me of destroying family unity over money. Rose flooded my phone with articles about successful galleries, messages from supportive friends, and tearful voice recordings insisting I was the only obstacle between her and her future. 3 weeks later, I came home from a brutal 12-hour shift to find my parents and Rose sitting in my apartment. They had convinced my landlord there was a family emergency and obtained access. The coffee table was covered with business articles, testimonials, and a revised version of Rose's business plan. Dad proudly handed me another folder. Rose pointed to a newspaper article about a gallery that had become successful. I quickly noticed the owner had spent 15 years working in major galleries before opening her own business. Rose had no comparable experience. When I pointed that out, Mom accused me of being cruel. Then Rose burst into dramatic sobs, crying that I hated her and cared more about money than family. For a brief moment, I almost questioned myself, but then I remembered every time she'd manipulated people to get what she wanted, while avoiding responsibility. I quietly told them to leave. When they hesitated, I raised my voice. Get out, all of you. They eventually left, but the harassment continued through calls, texts, emails, and surprise visits until I blocked every number and changed my locks. The silence lasted exactly 1 week. Then I was served with legal papers while working at the hospital. Standing in the break room, I opened the envelope and stared in disbelief. My parents, with Rose listed as a co-plaintiff, were suing me for breach of family financial obligations and unjust enrichment. According to the lawsuit, because I had lived at home until I was 19, benefited from food, housing, and family support, my success belonged partly to them. Therefore, they claimed they deserved $120,000 from the sale of my apartment, the exact amount Rose wanted for her gallery. They even argued I had caused Rose emotional and financial harm by refusing to support her business. I left work early and spent the afternoon searching for an attorney. After several expensive consultations, I met Marcus Rodriguez, a family business lawyer with years of experience handling disputes between relatives. He reviewed the lawsuit and immediately shook his head. The claims were legally weak. Parents are required to support their minor children, he explained. Adult children do not owe reimbursement for being raised. Refusing to invest in a sibling's business also creates no legal liability. He warned me that even frivolous lawsuits cost money to defend because families often rely on legal expenses to pressure people into settling. His retainer was $5,000 enough to begin the defense. It would delay my duplex purchase, but I refused to surrender. Before I left, Marcus added one more observation. He had researched my parents' attorney and believed the case existed only because someone had accepted payment to file questionable paperwork. I hired him the following morning. The lawsuit wasn't really about Rose's gallery anymore. It was about whether I would spend the rest of my life allowing my family to control my financial decisions. Marcus immediately began building a complete record of my independence. We gathered years of bank statements, tuition payments, rent receipts, mortgage documents, tax returns, and employment records showing I had supported myself completely since leaving home. Seeing everything organized together was eye-opening. Over 6 years, I had paid more than $180,000 in tuition, housing, transportation, and living expenses without financial help from anyone. Discovery also uncovered something revealing about my parents. They had borrowed $35,000 against their home to finance both Rose's gallery and the lawsuit itself. Their desperation was even worse than I'd imagined. Meanwhile, Rose ignored reality and opened a scaled-down version of her gallery anyway. Instead of the expensive downtown location, she rented a small strip mall storefront with almost no foot traffic. She painted the walls herself, assembled inexpensive lighting, and tried to create an upscale atmosphere with secondhand furniture. Her grand opening attracted barely 15 people, mostly family friends. Within weeks, her social media posts shifted from excitement to increasingly desperate promotions and discounts. While she struggled to sell artwork, I continued searching for duplexes with a pre-approved loan and a realistic investment strategy. Marcus kept me updated as my parents' lawyer attempted procedural delays, hoping mounting legal costs would force me into a settlement. Instead, Every document strengthened our case. Mine showed years of responsible financial independence. Theirs showed mounting debt, personal loans, maxed out credit cards, and increasingly reckless decisions, all because they refused to accept that I had every right to say no. 3 months after being served, I no longer feared the lawsuit. I feared only what it had revealed about the people I once called family. The hearing took place 8 months after the lawsuit was filed. Marcus met me outside the courthouse and explained that the judge would first decide whether my parents' claims had any legal basis. My parents and Rose were already waiting with their attorney. Rose wore a dramatic black dress that looked more suited to an art opening than a courtroom. Mom wore her church dress, and Dad had on the same suit he'd worn to my nursing school graduation. When Judge Patricia Chen called the case, my parents' attorney argued that because they had supported me throughout childhood, they deserved a share of my financial success. He claimed I had benefited from years of free housing, food, and family support that allowed me to build wealth, and that refusing to fund Rose's gallery violated an implied family obligation. Judge Chen immediately questioned whether he was seriously arguing that adult children were legally required to finance a sibling's business. The attorney tried to frame it as unjust enrichment and mutual family support, but his explanation grew weaker with every question. Marcus then presented our evidence. He walked the judge through years of bank statements, tuition records, mortgage payments, and employment history, proving that everything I owned had been earned through my own work. He explained that parents fulfilling their legal duty to raise a child did not create a lifelong debt. If that argument were accepted, every successful adult could be sued simply for becoming financially independent. Judge Chen asked whether my parents' attorney had any legal precedent supporting such a claim. He searched through his papers but failed to produce one. My parents were allowed to speak. Dad complained about family loyalty. Mom cried about Rose's shattered dreams. Rose insisted she had simply wanted a chance to build something meaningful and accused me of choosing money over family. When it was my turn, I kept my answer short. I had earned my savings through years of hard work, and no one else had the right to decide how I invested them. 12 minutes later, Judge Chen returned with her ruling. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again. My parents were ordered to pay my legal fees. Marcus smiled as we left the courtroom. He admitted the case had been even weaker than he'd expected. Although I had won completely, the victory felt hollow. My own parents had dragged me into court simply because I refused to finance my sister's unrealistic business. Before I reached home, my phone filled with calls. Mom left a tearful voicemail accusing me of letting the family fall apart. Dad said I had destroyed everything over money. Rose declared that I had crushed her dreams forever. I ignored every message. That evening, my coworker Cassie brought Chinese food and wine to celebrate. She reminded me that families do not sue each other for refusing to fund risky investments. She was right, but it didn't erase the pain. My parents eventually asked to repay my legal fees in monthly installments because they couldn't afford the lump sum. I agreed. I had no desire to force them into losing their house. The real damage wasn't financial. News of the lawsuit spread through the extended family, and the story quickly became that I had abandoned my sister instead of supporting her artistic dream. Rose carefully portrayed herself as the victim online while never mentioning the lawsuit or the demand for $120,000. Meanwhile, her gallery continued failing exactly as I'd predicted. The poor location, weak business model, and lack of experience produced almost no sales. 6 months after the trial, I closed on the duplex I'd planned to buy from the beginning. The upstairs tenant covered most of the mortgage, and I finally had the financial stability I'd worked toward for years. I had protected my future, even though it had cost me nearly every family relationship I once valued. 8 months after opening Rose's gallery closed for good, Cassie noticed the empty storefront first. The business had quietly disappeared. Over time, I learned that Rose had burned through roughly $40,000 in borrowed money while selling only a few $1,000s worth of artwork. She still owed several artists money and had fallen behind on rent before abandoning the space. My parents had financed nearly everything by borrowing against their house and running up credit cards. Now, they faced foreclosure. Mrs. Kim, my former neighbor, told me my mother looked exhausted and admitted they might lose the family home. Hearing that hurt more than I expected because it had been my childhood home, but I also knew they had created this disaster themselves. Eventually, Dad called for the first time since court. His voice sounded defeated. He admitted I had been right about the gallery and confessed they were about to lose the house. He asked whether I felt satisfied watching them suffer. I answered honestly. I wasn't happy they were losing their home, but I wasn't surprised either. They had borrowed money they couldn't afford to gamble on a business that never made financial sense. Dad quietly admitted they had hoped everything would somehow work out, or that I would eventually give in and rescue them. I reminded him that hope had never been a financial strategy. Over the following weeks, my family suddenly became apologetic. Mom admitted the lawsuit had been wrong. Rose sent a long handwritten apology, explaining that her dream had been genuine, even if her planning had not. Aunt Patricia and cousin Jake also reached out, pretending they wanted to repair family relationships. Then Mrs. Kim warned me that my parents had been asking about my work schedule and whether I lived alone. Soon afterward, I came home to find all three of them waiting in my driveway. They apologized again and spoke at length about healing the family. I listened quietly, knowing there was another reason for the visit. Eventually, Dad admitted they were about to lose the house and had found a duplex to rent. They insisted they weren't asking for money. They only wanted me to co-sign the lease because the landlord required a stronger financial applicant. I stared at them in disbelief. After spending a year trying to destroy my financial security, they now wanted me legally responsible for their rent. I refused immediately. If they had truly learned from their mistakes, they wouldn't need someone else to guarantee their obligations. Mom cried. Rose accused me of letting my own family become homeless. I reminded them they were not homeless because of me. They were facing the consequences of their own financial decisions. I told them once again that I would not risk my future to solve problems they had created. They left without another word. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Kim told me they had moved out of the house in the middle of the night after foreclosure became unavoidable. 2 years have passed since that final meeting, and my life has become exactly what I hoped it would. I'm writing this from the sunroom of my duplex overlooking the garden I planted after moving in. Buying the duplex turned out to be the best financial decision I ever made. My upstairs tenant pays $1,200 each month, covering most of my mortgage, while I continue building equity. 6 months ago, I left my full-time hospital position and began working as a freelance nurse through several agencies. The flexibility has been life-changing. I choose my own schedule, take time off whenever I want, and earn more than I did working full-time because my housing costs are so low. I also completed a medical writing course and now write for healthcare publications, combining my nursing experience with another source of income. Every improvement I make to the duplex increases its value. I renovated the kitchen, expanded the backyard garden, and even started selling fresh herbs to local restaurants. Financially, my future has never looked stronger. Through Mrs. Kim and a few mutual acquaintances, I eventually learned what happened to my family. They lost the house to foreclosure exactly as Dad had warned. The bank sold it for less than they owed, leaving them with even more debt. They moved into a small apartment across town because their damaged credit made it nearly impossible to qualify for a traditional lease. Dad was forced into early retirement when warehouse work became too physically demanding, and he now works part-time at a hardware store while collecting reduced retirement benefits. Mom continues working at a department store, but together they struggle just to cover basic expenses. Rose moved back in with them after the gallery failed, but constant arguments over money ended that arrangement within months. She later moved in with a boyfriend. But the relationship collapsed after he discovered the extent of her debts. The last I heard, she was working at a coffee shop and renting a tiny studio apartment she could barely afford. The gallery remained the only business experience on her resume, and it had lasted just 8 months. They still owed Marcus money from the court judgment and continued making slow monthly payments. I even asked Marcus not to pursue wage garnishment. I didn't want revenge. I simply wanted them to honor the legal obligation they had created for themselves. According to Mrs. Kim, my parents still tell people I abandoned them during their time of need. Even after everything that happened, they cannot admit that their own decisions caused their financial collapse. They still blame me for refusing to fund Rose's dream instead of accepting that no responsible investment ever existed. I no longer argue with that version of events. People who truly know me understand the truth. I don't feel triumphant about my family's struggles, but I don't feel guilty either. Every major decision they made, from demanding $120,000 to filing a frivolous lawsuit to asking me to co-sign another financial obligation, was an attempt to transfer the consequences of their choices onto me. I refused every time, and that refusal protected the future I had spent years building. Looking back, I sometimes wonder whether Rose could have succeeded under different circumstances. Maybe with years of experience, a realistic budget, a better location, and lower expectations, she might have built a successful gallery someday. But that wasn't the path she chose. She wanted immediate success, financed by someone else's sacrifice, instead of earning it herself. I chose financial security over family pressure, and I have never regretted that decision. Losing my family was painful, but the relationships I lost depended entirely on my willingness to sacrifice my own future for theirs. Once I stopped doing that, those relationships disappeared because they had never been built on mutual respect. Today, I have security, independence, and peace of mind. I travel when I want work, because I choose to, and continue building wealth, one responsible decision at a time. The greatest lesson I learned wasn't simply how to protect my money. It was how to protect my boundaries. Financial independence means more than having savings or property. It means having the courage to defend what you've built, even when the people closest to you demand that you give it away. 2 years later, I'm thriving because I refused to let anyone else decide what my future was worth. 3 years after the courthouse doors closed behind me, I drove past my old neighborhood for the first time in a long while. The house where I'd grown up looked different. Fresh paint covered the faded siding. Children's bicycles sat in the driveway and flower beds lined the front walk. A young family had turned it into a home again. Instead of feeling sad, I smiled, because that chapter of my life had finally ended. Life in my duplex continued to grow in all the right ways. The following year, I purchased the neighboring property after another carefully planned investment, adding a second rental unit and another reliable source of income. My freelance nursing career flourished because I could choose assignments that challenged me without sacrificing my personal life. The medical writing work I had started on the side became a steady business, allowing me to reduce my hospital shifts even further. For the first time in my life, my schedule wasn't controlled by financial stress. I traveled to places I'd only dreamed about while working endless double shifts, spent peaceful mornings in my garden instead of worrying about overdue bills, and watched every goal I'd once written in a notebook slowly become reality. None of it happened by luck. It happened because I stayed disciplined when it mattered most. From time to time, mutual acquaintances mentioned my parents. They were still renting the same apartment and still struggling financially. Dad's health had declined. Mom continued working well past the retirement she had hoped for, and Rose remained employed at the same coffee shop. From everything I heard, she no longer talked about opening galleries or becoming an entrepreneur. Reality had finally taught her lessons that no one else's money ever could. One afternoon, I received an unexpected envelope in the mail. Inside was the final payment receipt for the court judgment. After years of monthly installments, my parents had finally finished paying the legal fees they owed. There was no apology, no letter, and no request to rebuild our relationship. Just the receipt. I folded it, placed it in my filing cabinet, and quietly closed the drawer, knowing it represented the final financial connection between us. People sometimes ask whether I regret choosing money over family. I always give the same answer. I never chose money over family. I chose responsibility over entitlement, planning over wishful thinking, accountability over manipulation, and the future I'd spent years building over someone else's unrealistic expectations. Healthy families celebrate one another's success. They don't demand ownership of it, weaponize guilt, or drag each other into court because someone refused to finance a reckless dream. Love should never come with invoices, lawsuits, or impossible obligations. Looking back now, I realized the apartment I sold wasn't the greatest investment I ever made. The greatest investment was believing that my hard work had value and refusing to let anyone convince me otherwise. That decision gave me far more than financial security. It gave me peace, confidence, independence, and the freedom to build a life based on my own choices instead of someone else's demands. Sometimes the most painful thing you lose is the illusion that family will always do what's right. But sometimes letting go of that illusion is exactly what allows you to build the life you truly deserve.